How's it going, everyone? Mitch here with another tips and tricks video. This is number 10, and I'm going to be talking about how to maintain your CPU so that you aren't bottoming out that CPU all the time and crashing Logic. That's not good, obviously not at all. So my first tip and thing that I want to get across to you first is that if you are working with a highly MIDI song, something that has a lot of software instruments, and sometimes all those software instruments might be playing at the same time. This means that all your CPU needs to work extra hard to make sure all of these software instruments are playing, and sometimes that can cause the CPU to crash and overload. Alright? So how do we combat this? How do we get past this? My initial idea, and the one that I've been using for a very long time, is to take the track and bounce it to an audio file, then delete the old track. This does pose a couple problems though, and that is that you can't go back to the MIDI file, change the notes. You can't go to the software instrument, change what the sound is that these MIDI notes are pointing to. You just can't go back and edit it at all, and that is a pretty big problem. So I found another cool feature in Logic. It is called the freeze, and if you right click on your track, you can select the freeze, and what happens is there's a snowflake that comes up on all of your tracks in the main window. Now what does this do? If you have a MIDI track and you freeze it, what that's going to do is it's going to take all of your MIDI and your software instrument, and it's going to convert the sounds that it's playing into an audio file, and then it's not going to be using your software instrument, and this will help with the CPU a ton. Alright, but there is one downside to that, and then that is that you can't edit the MIDI file or anything of that matter, because there you go, it will say track is frozen. You can't do anything. Would you like to unfreeze it? And so you can unfreeze it, and then you can move all your audio files around, edit notes inside of them, do whatever you want inside of your software instruments, whatever. So you have to constantly be going back in frozen and unfrozen states, and although this is good for your CPU, this does get pretty annoying pretty quickly. So if you are in the mixing and production stage, be careful with how many tracks you freeze, because that will piss you off. So that is the first tip. Second tip is reverb. If you are using the Space Designer, which I highly suggest you use, the best reverb inside of Logic, the Reverb Space Designer is a highly CPU intensive plugin, and if you have that plugin set on a million different tracks and playing all at the same time, that is a lot of the CPU that is taken up by this one plugin, just many iterations of it. So what you can do to combat this is, if you have a bunch of tracks that all have the same reverb in them, just select all of them, all of the ones that you want reverb on, and send it to an effects bus, any bus, it doesn't really matter. And you can make sure to turn up the bus send, how much of the tracks you're going to send. You can edit these individually, it doesn't really matter. I'm just going to set all of them to a certain point. And then if you go to that auxiliary track, you can put a single Space Designer plugin on it, and all these tracks will have this reverb on them, and all it is just going to be pushing all these tracks to the single place and then adding reverb onto it. The only problem with this is that since all of these tracks are being sent to this one place, you need to be careful with the volume that is coming out of this auxiliary track, because it could be quite a bit, and so you might have to mess with the volume fader just to get it perfectly. And also another way to combat this is to make sure you have low sends. The amount of the track that you send to it, have it relatively low. You don't really need too much on it, but yeah, just group all the tracks that have the same reverb in them, and then send it to a bus and use just one single reverb, and that will also help with your CPU. Alrighty. Now, the last thing, I want to talk about latency very quickly. Now, latency, there's a few things that go into it. If you go into your preferences and then into your audio, you can see that we have a buffer size. Buffer size and latency correspond to each other. Alright, so let me talk about this a little bit. Latency, what is latency? Latency is, if you're talking into a microphone, it's the delay that is when the computer records the actual audio from the microphone. The time in between those two things is called the latency, and sometimes this gets to be quite a bit, and it gets annoying, especially if you have to listen to the song and you singing or doing whatever into the microphone. It gets very annoying, and it can mess you up quite a bit. And this also happens with MIDI keyboards and whatever. So if you want to get rid of this latency, you need to decrease the buffer size. Decreasing the buffer size will increase the amount of CPU that you are using. So there's a fine line between the buffer size, latency, and CPU usage, and you need to find the point at which this works out perfectly. Sometimes it won't. Sometimes you will have to have a delay latency if your computer doesn't have enough CPU to get through it, and at that point you might have to mute the track that you're recording on and then just listen to the backing track. And I've had to do that a couple times, and it sucks, but what can you do? What can you do? Alright, so if you aren't using a ton of I/O, if you're not using like a MIDI keyboard and microphones all the time, whatever it is, you can increase the buffer size to help with your CPU, and it goes up to 1000. So choose what you want, but make sure that if you are going to record MIDI or audio, that you need to mess with the buffer size so that the latency is little to none. Alright, so those are the 3 things I want to talk about. Thanks for watching, everyone. Mitch here with another tips and tricks video. Please comment, rate, subscribe like a freaking boss. And I will be seeing you very soon. Peace out.